What I'm about to show you now was literally burned out of history. People were killed just for talking about it, but they couldn't erase everything because a piece of this truth survived. And today, you're going to see it with your own eyes. Yes, this is the spiritual knowledge that was almost deleted from Earth, but it still pulses, and you're going to feel it now, because while the Cathars were being burned, a forgotten master left behind a sacred code hidden in time. His name was Thoth, and what he taught can unlock something you didn't even know was locked. In this video, I'm going to show you what the church tried to destroy, what the Inquisitors buried, and what Thoth revealed millennia ago. You're going to understand what's happening with the world right now. You're going to see why you feel lost, disconnected, and how that was programmed. But hold on. I'm not going to give it all to you at once, because if you watch until the end, you'll understand why the Cathars died smiling. They knew something that changes everything, and that secret starts with what I'm about to show you now. From here on, you're going to step onto a path that no one walks away from the same. Oh man, you are deceived by what you see, for your eyes do not perceive the hidden essence. Learn to see with the inner light, for only then will you escape the cycle of illusion. The Cathars saw the material world as a prison, but not a prison with walls, bars, and jailers. It was something much more subtle, much more dangerous. It was a prison made of form, of flesh, of time, of repetition, an endless cycle of birth, pain, attachment, death, and again, birth. A carefully designed game meant to seem real, but at its core, it was a sophisticated illusion. And the creator of this game? A dark architect. A being that was not God, but desperately wanted to be treated as such. This being, in the Cathar view, was a forger of the sacred, an imitator, a cosmic engineer who built the material world as a golden cage full of desires, pleasures, and rules, all to keep the soul distracted, fragmented, amnesiac. The Cathars called him the Demiurge, an ancient name inherited from the first Gnostics, an archetype present in almost every wisdom tradition, an impostor who hides behind doctrines, institutions, and dogmas to appear divine, but who feeds on the spiritual ignorance of human beings. To the Cathars, this was the root of suffering. The visible world was not a blessing. It was a trap. And the one who ruled this world was not the God of light, love, and freedom. It was the prince of this world, the same one Jesus mentions as the ruler of darkness, a blind being, arrogant and hungry for worship. In the Emerald Tablets, Thoth also describes this being. He calls him the Lord of Darkness, a hidden ruler who traps souls in cycles of time, fear, and matter. He says, dwelling in the halls of Amenti are the lords of darkness, imprisoning the souls with invisible chains. These chains are not made of iron. They are made of erased memory, of unresolved desire, of unconscious repetition. Thoth explains that this being has no body, but lives in forms, manipulates symbols, uses language, controls through illusion, exactly as the Cathars described centuries later, without ever having had direct access to these Hermetic texts. In initiatic alchemy, this same principle is called falsus rex mundi, the false king of the world, an archetype that governs appearances, that turns lead into more lead, that promises liberation through accumulation, glory, and obedience, but in the end, only feeds the illusion. It is the fire that does not purify. It is the gold that rots. He rules through the senses, creates religions that sell salvation, systems that produce guilt, societies that keep man enslaved to himself. Does all this sound familiar? That's because it is. It's right in front of our eyes all the time. but only those who break free from the collective hypnosis can see it. The Cathars could. That's why they were persecuted. Not for denying God, but for exposing the impostor. The prison they saw was not visible. It was vibrational. A dense energy field where every human being is born already under the effects of forgetting and grows up believing that pain, competition, scarcity, and control are natural, when in truth, they're just symptoms of a manipulated reality. Thoth's teachings make this even clearer. He didn't use the term Demiurge, but he spoke of the forces that work in the invisible to keep men in ignorance. And he said, "Flee from the darkness, always seek the light, and when you find the light, you will never again be a slave." It is a direct statement, a calling, because to escape the prison, you first need to know it exists. But the Cathars didn't stop there. They discovered something that changed everything. A gap, a flaw, a vulnerable point inside the illusion itself. Something the dark architect couldn't erase. A real exit from the cycle of forgetting. A secret language. A vibrational code that is still alive. And that gap is still recorded today in symbols that have survived for millennia. The wisdom buried in the mountains. Not in libraries, not in universities. It was kept where the system doesn't dare to look, in the silent mountains of southern France, in the misty valleys of the ancient region of Languedoc, among worn stones, humble villages, and voices that whispered ancient knowledge behind serene eyes. There, far from golden cathedrals and the palaces of institutionalized faith, there was a people who simply did not bow down. They wore no crowns, carried no swords, had no luxurious temples or elevated pulpits, and yet their presence disturbed kings, popes, and feudal lords. Because wherever they went, something changed. Fear dissolved, guilt lost its grip, and the sacred, which had been hijacked by institutions, returned to dwell in the human gaze. These men and women walked lightly, but what they carried was a spiritual heritage thousands of years old. They were the Cathars. They lived with little, but they had everything. Their clothes were simple, their words direct, their actions quiet. They didn't try to convert anyone, but their mere existence was already a threat. Because, without saying a word, they disproved the entire narrative built by the dominant religion. They said through example, you don't need an intermediary to speak to the divine. You don't need to pay for forgiveness. You don't need fear to love. And that unraveled the entire show. The world called it heresy. But what they were doing deep down was remembering. They were simply remembering. They didn't invent anything. They just reconnected with a truth that was buried not only beneath the soil of the mountains, but inside the human heart. A truth the ancient masters already knew, that Thoth had already recorded, that Hermes Trismegistus had encoded in his dialogues, and that the alchemists protected with seals and metaphors. Thoth said, before man can rise into the light, he must first quiet the noise of the mind and silence the scream of the ego. That was the first step of initiation. The return to 0 point, the sacred void, the same principle of initiatic alchemy known as solve, the emptying. It's necessary to dissolve the old, release attachments, clear inner structures so true transformation can begin. The Cathars did this in practice. They lived the solve, not as an external ritual, but as a way of life. They didn't fast out of dogma, but because they knew a light body helps the soul to listen. They didn't isolate themselves out of disdain for the world, but out of love for what lay beyond it. They took no political or military oaths, because they knew every pact with the system was a step away from the source. They wore no sacred garments or insignias, because the sacred to them was a state of being, They were known as the good men, the good Christians. But not in a doctrinal sense. They were good because they were whole, transparent, peaceful. They reflected light without flaunting it. And as living mirrors of the divine presence, they healed with just a look, transformed spaces with their silence. They knew that light doesn't need advertising. It simply is. And when it appears, everything that is not true dissolves. And because of that, even in the face of threats, they didn't back down. Even when they were expelled, they didn't react with violence. When persecuted, they didn't curse. When defamed, they didn't justify themselves. Because they were anchored in something that could not be shaken by fire, nor by sword, nor by papal decree. The world could call it heresy, but they knew they were simply remembering what the whole world had forgotten. And there was a moment when that remembering became total, when the veil tore, when time stopped, and when the soul, at last, rose above the world. That moment had a name, but it wasn't just a name. It was a fire. It was the most sacred and most feared rite among the Cathars, called the Consolamentum. But don't be mistaken. This wasn't a symbolic baptism or a theatrical ceremony. It was a dividing line between worlds, a real act of spiritual transmutation. When a Cathar received the Consolamentum, they were no longer the same. They no longer belonged to the world. Their desires died. Their fears ceased. The body was still there, but it was no longer a prison. It became a passageway. It was as if the soul, finally awake, said, "Now, I remember who I am." The deepest part of this rite was that it wasn't imposed. It was requested. The initiate only received the Consolamentum when they were ready to let go of everything: family, possessions, ambitions, but most of all, the old self. They had to die while still alive. And this death was not a metaphor. It was a complete emptying, a letting go of the constructed personality, a return to pure essence. It was the rebirth of the conscious spirit within the body. This practice has direct parallels with the deepest teachings of Hermeticism. In the Corpus Hermeticum, Hermes Trismegistus describes this moment as the second generation of man. The first generation is biological, carnal, made of instinct and illusion. But the second is spiritual, vibrational. It's when man becomes divine without ceasing to be human. He says, "Blessed are those who purify themselves, for they will be regenerated and will see the divine with the eyes of the heart." This rebirth was the heart of the Consolamentum. And the effects weren't only internal. There were reports of luminosity in the body, lightness in movement, of spontaneous wisdom appearing in the eyes. It was as if the initiate became a direct channel between heaven and earth. And because of that, they could no longer lie, nor hate, nor belong to the old world. It was a definitive break from the cycle of illusion. In alchemy, this corresponds to the stage of rubedo, the bright red of the awakened soul, when gold is finally revealed after the phases of dissolution and purification. The alchemist called this the fixing of the light, when the essence no longer escapes, when the spirit no longer gets lost in form. In the Emerald Tablets, Thoth speaks of something even more powerful. He reveals an invisible fire, a fire that does not burn the body but awakens the essence. He says, "Seek the hidden fire, the one that lives without form and burns within silence. For this is the fire that opens the gates of eternity." This same fire was what the Consolamentum ignited. It wasn't visible, but it was real. It could be felt, and more than that, it could be transmitted. The Cathars believed that this fire came from a world above this one, that it crossed dimensions to reignite the divine memory asleep in each being. And once activated, it could not be extinguished, even if the body died, even if the flesh was burned, because what was awakened was eternal. And the most incredible thing is that this same fire also appears in records much older than the Cathars, including in texts left behind by Thoth. Light that imitates light, the spiritual deception. This fire is not exclusive to one tradition. It is a reminder, a silent signal that something inside us is still alive, even when everything seems extinguished. For the Cathars, this was the central truth. The soul was not born in sin. It was born in light. It is not a mistake that needs to be corrected. It is a particle of the divine that was kidnapped, imprisoned, covered up. The soul is a ray of the source, lost inside an illusion called the world, a captivity where everything was designed so it would never remember where it came from. But sometimes it remembers, and in that instant, everything changes. The Cathars didn't speak of salvation as a reward, nor of damnation as punishment. They spoke of memory, of a kind of awakening that can't be taught in words, but that explodes inside like a silent lightning bolt. A sudden remembering that makes the heart beat differently, as if something within you said, "I know this is true. I've always known." That remembering was the key, because when the spark starts to remember, it starts to move. It starts to vibrate differently, and that disrupts the field of illusion. It makes the gears of the system grind. The awakened spark needs no permission, no explanation. It simply is. And that is unacceptable to those who profit from unconsciousness. In the Emerald Tablets, Thoth reveals that the soul was imprisoned in the halls of Amenti, vibrational planes of forgetting, where consciousness is tested, obscured, and diverted from its origin. But he also says this prison is not eternal, that whoever seeks sincerely will find the way back. He says, "Within you is the eternal light, but to find it, you must look inward and pass through the veil of shadows." That's exactly what the Cathars did, not with external rituals, but with a way of life that kept that spark lit. They didn't create rules, they created silence. They didn't raise temples, they raised states of consciousness. They didn't teach formulas, they taught presence. And that presence allowed the soul, little by little, to begin dissolving the captivity around it. Initiatic alchemy describes this as the revelation of inner gold, a gold that was always there, but covered in layers of psychic lead. Fear, attachment, vanity, hurry, shame. All of that builds up like spiritual rust. But the true initiate doesn't try to shine on the outside. They heat the inner furnace until the lead begins to melt. And then, the gold appears. This gold can't be stolen, or faked, or given by another, because it is what you are. It's what you've always been. It's what the Cathars called the spark. And the most powerful part of this teaching is that it didn't require belief. It required listening. Those who heard the call of the spark knew, not with the mind, but with the soul. And it's exactly at that moment, when the spark starts to remember, that something happens. An invisible movement begins around it, as if hidden forces once asleep sensed the risk. Because one awakened soul awakens others, and when that happens, the whole game begins to fall apart. And when the spark begins to remember, invisible forces move to stop it from returning to the light. These forces don't show up screaming, or with chains. They come in disguise, whispering half-truths, offering comfort in exchange for submission. promising salvation, as long as you obey without question, praising virtue, as long as you bow. The most dangerous thing about spiritual deception is that it doesn't look like darkness. It shines. But that shine is a trap. The Cathars knew that. They knew not all light is true, that there are spiritual intelligences that imitate light, but serve control, guilt, and inner paralysis. These are forces that feed on blind obedience, mechanical repetition, fear disguised as faith. They present themselves as guides, but they imprison. They speak of love, but demand total denial of your own essence. They don't burn the body, they burn the spirit. These entities don't want you to be lost. They want you to think you've been found, so you never truly seek again. That is the greatest trick of false light, to offer shallow, artificial peace, conditioned on submission. And many, tired of the pain of the world, accept this illusory truce. But the soul does not rest, because deep down something still whispers. This is not freedom. In the Corpus Hermeticum, Hermes Trismegistus speaks clearly about these archons. Subtle beings, invisible to physical eyes, but present in the vibrational layers of the human mind. They rule over the planes of the sensory world. They feed on ignorance, and their work is simple: to keep man from remembering his divine origin. They confuse, divide, create spiritual paths full of rituals, difficult words, and hierarchies, all to keep the soul busy, tired, and far from the essential. In initiatic alchemy, this phenomenon is called impure fire. It's a heat that seems to transmute, but only destroys. It burns fast, creates euphoria, promises instant results. But in the end, it leaves ashes and exhaustion, because it doesn't come from the source. It comes from the desire to control, from the egoic impulse to speed up the process without truly emptying oneself. And Thoth warned of this too. In the Emerald Tablets, he mentions the Lords of Illusion, beings that shine brightly, but whose light doesn't warm, doesn't guide, doesn't heal. It only distracts. He warns, there is light that is not light. There is voice that does not come from above. Know the vibration, feel the heart, for truth never forces. It draws through silence. That's the difference. True light does not seduce. It reveals. It does not demand. It invites. And that's why so many true masters were silenced. Because they didn't control. They liberated. They didn't demand loyalty. They awakened awareness. And the Cathars were on that path. They lived a clean spirituality, direct, without ornaments, without power games. They cut through the masks of the world with presence, and because of that, they disturbed, without knowing the name, without reading the books, without accessing the Hermetic codes. They embodied what the ancients had already left as a map. Their practices, their silence, their way of living, were in alignment with the deepest teachings of spiritual regeneration, as if an ancient wisdom, far older than themselves, was echoing through them. Because an ancient master left clear instructions for passing through those false lights. And the Cathars followed that path without even knowing his name. Not because they knew it directly, but because those teachings had already been passed down and transmitted for millennia. Thoth, the whisper that survived time. This master was Thoth, but he never wanted to be worshipped. He didn't found a religion. He didn't demand obedience. What Thoth did was record. He wrote in stone. What can only be read with an awakened heart. His teachings weren't directed at crowds. They were planted for those who one day would dare to feel. And that day is returning. Thoth said that truth doesn't need shouting, that pure silence holds more power than 1,000 confused voices, that the word is only truly the word when it's born clean, without interference, without the desire for control. To him, the word wasn't just a common word. It was a sacred sound, a vibrational pulse that resonated throughout the body and crossed through time. It was like a code, not to be translated, but to be activated. He called it the key that commands matter. And this is where everything connects. The Cathars, living centuries later, never studied Thoth. But they followed the same path. They rejected temples, they rejected idols, they rejected prepared speeches, and they began to feel, to vibrate, to live in a state of full awareness. They discovered in practice that the truth isn't above or outside, but within. Thoth said the fire of awakening lives inside the secret chamber of man, that when the sacred word is spoken at the right moment and with total purity, that fire is lit, and the body vibrates differently. The soul wakes up, the illusion begins to fall apart. And this word is not read, it is remembered. Hermeticism speaks of exactly this, a primordial sound that is not learned but recognized, that lies dormant in the blood, waiting for a gesture, a silence, a presence. And when this word is activated, it doesn't just inform, it transforms, it dissolves time, it burns away the layers that cover the inner gold. This is the same fire of the Consolamentum, the transmutation that doesn't come from outside, but from direct contact with the origin. And now, this teaching, once sealed by fire and silence, is starting to vibrate again. Not in books, but within you. Because everything begins in the body. The Cathars knew that. They didn't build churches. They built presence. The body, for them, was the only cathedral that couldn't be destroyed by soldiers or decrees. Because it was invisible. And at the same time, real. Each breath was an offering, each movement, a ritual, each choice, a purification. They didn't speak of salvation, they spoke of vibration. Thoth did too. In the Emerald Tablets, he describes 7 inner chambers that can only be accessed through sound, frequency, and the alignment of body and spirit. The body wasn't seen as a burden, it was a bridge, a sacred vessel where the soul could remember what it is and what it came to do. Alchemy called this the white work. It's the moment when the initiate has emptied themselves of beliefs, dogmas, distorted memories. The moment when the ego no longer controls the word, and then speech becomes command. Not an external order, but an energetic encoding that shapes the field around it. Because when the inner frequency is coherent, the world responds. The word becomes real. It's in that state that the body vibrates like the spirit, and the spirit pulses within the flesh without getting lost. That's where the word of Thoth meets the silence of the Cathars. And there is a point within your body where the word of Thoth and the silence of the Cathars meet, and it is ready to be reactivated. You are the truth. They died protecting. And there is a point within your body where Thoth's word and the silence of the Cathars meet, and it's ready to be reactivated. Because when that point lights up, the illusion begins to dissolve, not from the outside in, but like mist that evaporates at the touch of the sun. And what we once called reality reveals itself as a layer. The Cathars knew this. For them, the end of the world wasn't a tragedy. It was a revelation. It was when the veil would be torn, when the light would gather its parts again, not through destruction, but through the return of clarity. Matter wasn't evil. It was simply condensed forgetting. The body, time, flesh, all of it was symbolic. All of it was temporary. The true end was awakening. Thoth called this the return to the one light, a state where time no longer divides, where identity is no longer a weight, where the word is so silent it merges with the light. In Hermeticism, this is called the return to the one, the end of illusory multiplicity, the reintegration of being with its source, a moment when the seeker discovers they were never separate, that the fall was a dream, and that ascension is simply the opening of the eyes. In initiatic alchemy, this is the philosopher's stone, not a substance, but a state of being. When the inner gold finally recognizes that it was gold all along, but it had to pass through lead, endure the fire, be dissolved in order to remember who. And when that portal is crossed, the remembering becomes irreversible, and nothing, not even the world, can imprison it again. It's in that moment that you understand what really happened. The Cathars were not defeated. They were seeds. They were called heretics. They were persecuted, silenced, burned. But what they carried could not catch fire, because it wasn't a word. It was vibration. It was truth in its purest form, not written in books, but tattooed on the spirit. Thoth wrote, "The light cannot be extinguished, only forgotten." And that's why they died in peace, because they knew that one day, somewhere in time, someone would remember. Someone would hear the silent vibration of all this and respond, not with hate, not with war, but with presence. And now, that someone is you. Hermeticism is clear. To know is not enough. One must embody. In other words, the truth doesn't change you because you read about it. It changes you when you become it. When every gesture of yours becomes a living memory of what cannot be said. And alchemy adds, true gold doesn't shine, it transforms. You don't need to repeat what the Cathars did, or live what Thoth lived, but you can continue what they started. You can be flame in a sleeping world, the light that doesn't impose, but invites, the remembrance that awakens without violence, the torch that burns, but only what no longer serves. Now, the torch is with you. The fire that they tried to extinguish has reignited in your awareness. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you remembered, something that can no longer be ignored. So here's what to do. Leave a comment saying, "The flame still lives," so I know you're one of the ones who haven't forgotten. And if you'd like to support this channel more directly, there's a link in the top pinned comment where you can contribute whatever you can and help us spread this kind of content around the world. Seriously, this means a lot to me and to the growth of this channel. Every bit of support, no matter how small, helps keep this mission alive. But look, if you can't contribute right now, just the fact that you watched until the end already helps me so much. If you want to take one more step, share this video with someone who needs to awaken. Sometimes, one spark changes everything. And don't leave just yet. There's a special video waiting for you right here on the screen. Click it now and I'll meet you there, in the next revelation.